We're going to open the meeting tonight. Nash Cox has an announcement that she would like to make, and then Gene Birch has an important announcement that he would like to make before we get to our guest speaker. So if Nash would like to come up and address the multitudes.
This is, I think, an issue. I don't know whether this is working or not, but it doesn't matter. This is an issue, I think, of concern to anybody interested in historic Frankfort. There is a meeting on Tuesday of the Architectural Review Board, and they are taking up two items that are, I think, pertinent. One is the demolition of a carriage house behind Harrod Brothers Funeral Home. And the carriage house is quite distinctive if you've ever noticed it. And I won't go into that in any more detail. I have some materials here which detail what happened on item 6. The last item on that agenda is one that particularly concerns me because it's the Bell South building on Washington Street. And Bell South has a big switching center there. They've had it since the early 1950s. And they have begun upgrading their air conditioning systems. And in doing so, they did not go before the Architectural Review Board, but they made a great many changes to the exterior of the building first, after they had already done the interior work. And the city finally placed a stop work order so that they couldn't do any more. They constructed a hoist 10 feet taller than a smaller hoist that was there originally. But this is very obtrusive in the landscape in the historic zone. They also came into my yard and started tearing out bricks and finally tore out 3 big openings. 2 of them are 10 feet tall by 5.5 feet. And these are for intake vents. And these intake vents will run 24 hours a day once the temperature reaches 55 degrees. They're to cool things off inside. My major complaint, obviously it makes life difficult for me, but my major complaint is that they did not ask permission first. They simply went ahead and did the work. And of course now we're at an impasse. But I wanted to just alert you to it. I've written up a little something about the work and some pictures as well. And there is a meeting Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And the first item will be, as I said, the demolition of the carriage house. The last item, the 6th item on the agenda, is the Bell South building. So anybody who would like a copy, I'd be happy to pass these out.
Well, it's finally here after probably a year and maybe 3 months of working on this project. And Cable 10, thank you for announcing this a lot of times, but it's finally here. It's 144 pages and about 190 very vintage images of Frankfort, some of which this group has donated, and we thank you. This book will go on sale Sunday at Poor Richard's Bookstore. We're also having a donor reception for the people who donated photos to give them a little discount on the book, and that'll be at Judd's Office Supply on Sunday from 1 to 4. So if anybody didn't get their announcement, please come to that. And then they'll be available at, like I said, Poor Richard's Books, Judd's Office Supply, and the History Center will be selling them. So, and we have a couple of copies here tonight if anybody wants to go through and look at them. Appreciate it.
Gene, will you be at the book fair?
We'll be at the book fair also.
Thank you very much, Gene. Now for our main speaker tonight, we're honored to have Dennis Shepard with us, who's going to talk to us about Paul Sawyier. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Dennis.
Thank you, John. My name is Dennis Shepard, and the name of this particular talk is Saving Paul Sawyier, and I'm going to tell you why in a few minutes. If you can't hear me, would you please raise your hand and say, I can't hear you? If you want to engage in any sort of discussion as I talk, you don't have to wait to the end. Just go ahead and ask questions or say something. Correct me if you want. I wanted to start by telling you my eminent qualifications for talking about Paul Sawyier. I have none. I have no art training. I'm not an art critic. I'm not an art historian. I think I may be very much like many of you. I just love Paul Sawyer. I love his work. I love about everything I read about his life. So I'm working on a book that I have titled Bridge Over the River of Time, the Paul Sawyer story. I want to depart from some of the other works on Paul Sawyer and come up with a book that is by just a Paul Sawyer art lover. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book that I'm working on, if you don't mind me reading a few pages. I want to first start by telling you how I got interested in Paul Sawyer. It's just a plain, fateful accident. About 3.5 years ago, there was a place in the Eastwood Shopping Center called the Tin Ceiling. Any of you ever visit the Tin Ceiling? And a very nice lady ran that store, and I would go in there on my lunch break from the Attorney General's office. And she had a very nice collection of Paul Sawyer prints, very nicely framed. And I picked one out for my house, and it was called Boone's Bluff. And I'm going to show you Boone's Bluff in a few minutes when we get to the slides. And I took it home, hung it up, and I looked at it, and I have kind of a meticulous scientific type of mind, and I just wondered, why in the world is it Boone's Bluff? Why did they call it Boone's Bluff? So I went back to the store because I was buying Paul Sawyer prints like they were going out of style from the Tin Ceiling. I'd never been in the Paul Sawyer gallery. And I asked the owner, why is it called Boone's Bluff? And she said, well, reportedly, Paul Sawyer painted this picture of the Kentucky River, the Singing Bridge, all of the buildings in Frankfort, this beautiful picture from the foot of Daniel Boone's grave. And that answered my question. So I went back home. One day I got my camera. I went up to Daniel Boone's grave, and I wanted to snap a picture of Boone's Bluff. And I found out something. The river does not bend that way. You can't possibly get a Boone's Bluff at the foot of Daniel Boone's grave. It can't be done. You go up and test my theory out, and you'll see. And I was driving my Explorer all over the place, trying to find out where was he when he painted Boone's Bluff. To the best of my knowledge and my discovery, if you go directly behind the arsenal, move a little bit to the left as you're looking at the Singing Bridge, that's where he painted Boone's Bluff. As a matter of fact, there's a very nice lady up there who owns a log house. You may know her. She's very nice. And she allowed me to take photographs from the foot of her house, and I even noticed, as you'll see in Boone's Bluff in a few minutes, the limestone formations at the bottom of her house that you see in Boone's Bluff. So that, to me, launched me on my journey to discover Paul Sawyer. And I've been working on that for about 3.5 years now. I had to halt my research and my drafting because another story came my way, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. That book will be coming out at the end of this month. And that kind of put Paul Sawyer on hold. And now I'm back to Paul Sawyer, and I'm glad I am. Today I'm going to first provide you a brief overview, just a thumbnail sketch of Paul Sawyer's life, so that those of you who really don't know too much about the details of his life can be on the same wavelength. Second, I'm going to give you just a preview of my book that I'm working on, because I want you to see how I'm approaching Paul Sawyer from the times in which he lived. I'm trying to connect him with key events in Frankfort, in the United States, in the world. You'll see that in a minute. And the last part of this presentation, we're going to have a slide presentation. And I'm going to introduce you to two ideas, and I made them up. I made them up from the standpoint of somebody who loves to look at Paul Sawyer works. And one of them is going to be a concept that I call significant meaning. That somehow Paul Sawyer was such a good artist, he would pick sites that belonged to a town that had significant meaning to that town. That's number one. And there's another concept I'm going to ask you to look at as we look at photographs and paintings side by side, and it's called conversion. I didn't get this from an art book. It just describes my feeling when I look at a Paul Sawyer painting. I wonder, how is it that he converted something rather plain out there into something magnificently beautiful? I call that conversion. We'll get to that. All right, the slideshow, when we go through it, I really do want to try to spark your interest as we go through that. Let me give you a timeline of Paul Sawyer's life, and before I do, I'm going to mention the 4 great sources of information about Paul Sawyer. Number 1, Willard Gilson, state of Kentucky geologist, wrote really the first comprehensive biography of Paul Sawyer. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to show you these books, and you can get them all. Number 2, we have a very special guest in the audience. We have John Glenn. And John Glenn's wife, the late Nettie Glenn, wrote what is a fictional account of Paul Sawyer, this beautiful book, Love to All Your Paul. Any of you read this one? Have this one? It's a beautiful book. And a couple of things about Nettie. First of all, she and I work in the same office. She worked in the Attorney General's office a number of years ago. I work in the Attorney General's office today. Secondly, even though it's called fiction because kind of like the Paul Sawyer play that's going on as we speak at Highbridge, she created conversations using the best information she had. So in that sense, it's fictional because we don't know that those conversations actually took place, but is extremely well researched. It is extremely accurate in its chronology and its details about Paul Sawyer's life. So it's a fun book to read, but it's also a very important book to read. Mr. Glenn has opened up her files, her research files, for my use in my book. And I really appreciate that, John. And last but not least is Professor Art Jones and the Art of Paul Sawyer. Now, this is something I don't want to copy. I'm not an artist. I'm not an art critic. Professor Jones wrote this, and his biography of Sawyer within this framework is very good, is very accurate, is very well researched. But he also includes a lot of technical things about Paul Sawyer's painting techniques that I would never go into. But it's also extremely a good treasure trove of Paul Sawyer information. And last, the 4th best source of getting information about Paul Sawyer and his life and his times is his art. His art tells us so much, and we'll go into that when we go into the slide presentation. Now, I call this Saving Paul Sawyer. Some of you may have wondered, why is it saving? What are we saving here? And I'm going to give you some ideas on what I think we're saving whenever we have groups like this, whenever we meet and we think about Paul Sawyer and what he's done. First of all, first and foremost, I think we need to save his art. We need to take efforts. We need to ask people, do they have it? We need to look for originals. What would you, those of you who really don't know the answer to this, what would you guess would be the number of paintings, original paintings, Paul Sawyer did over his lifetime? Remember, he only lived to be age 52. What would you guess? How many? Hundreds. Hundreds? Any other guesses? 3,000 is the best guess. 3,000. Now, I'll talk about that more in a second, because 3,000 is 3,000 original watercolors, oils, etchings over just a short 25 years of painting. That's a lot of original art.
Is that a guess?
That is a guess. That is a guess. Somebody has gone back and they've looked at what he's produced. They looked at the rate that he was producing it, and they come up with a ballpark guess of 3,000. It is also a guess that approximately 1,000, one-third of the 3,000, is in public view, is in public awareness. So the question is begged, where's the other 2,000? Now, in my estimation, we've probably lost a lot of those 2,000 that are not in public awareness. But let's just be conservative and say there's clearly 100 original Paul Sawyers that are not in public awareness. We need to find them. Paul Sawyer, one of the things that would drive me crazy as I would study him, he painted fast. He didn't have a lot of money. He could not get the best framing. He could not get the best material. And he didn't seem to care, as he was learning his craft, about preserving what he did. He was very sloppy about putting times, years, when he painted, what he painted, very sloppy about that. So it's extremely important that we try to find those other originals that are out there. And for those originals that we have that aren't in art museums, that aren't in galleries, they have to be taken care of, really taken care of. But there's another aspect to saving Paul Sawyer. In my opinion, we need to save an understanding of how important his art was to him and how important it's become to us. We need to save that too. And I'm going to give you an example, a few examples of how I think we can show art was important to Paul Sawyer the man. First of all, I think all good fathers, and I did this, see their sons sometimes laying around, sometimes taking up a hobby, not really doing what they want them to do, not earning a living when they probably should be. And Paul's father, Dr. Nathaniel Sawyer, was no different. And at some point, after Paul had had some art training, had some tutoring, his father owned the Kentucky River Mill Company, a hemp producing company, and they made twine. So at the age of 21 or 22, Paul Sawyer was ordered out to be a twine salesman. And he did that for 1 year. And he made a vow at the end of that year, I will never earn another penny except by my art. I think that shows you that that meant something to him. Something else I'm going through in my book that I hope you will appreciate, and that is the hardships of his times. Just imagine grabbing all of your equipment and going out into the Kentucky wilderness, living on the Kentucky River, or going into the Catskill Mountain wilderness and spending all day painting. Electricity is just coming in age, very few niceties. It's very, very rough for an artist to do that and then to produce the amount and the quality of work that Paul Sawyer did. So he must have been very dedicated. You'll hear rumors sometimes, well, Paul Sawyer was a drunk. There is nothing in my research that has led me to that conclusion. I've heard anecdotes that have come down from families, but there is nothing in my research to indicate anything except that, yes, he did enjoy to have a drink every once in a while. I don't think that's a crime. And in Nettie Glenn's book, of course, the name of the book is Love to All Your Paul. And that should tell you something. Paul Sawyer, in his time, always dressed neatly, always acted as a perfect gentleman. It was not unusual to see him even painting out in the wilds in a suit. So I think that speaks well of him, and that shows his dedication to his craft. The last little indicator that tells me that Paul Sawyer cared very much about his art, the place that he died. I'm going to give you a little thumbnail sketch of his life. Born in 1865, died in 1917, and he died in Fleischmann's, New York. He was far from home. It was November of 1917. He had just come back from a fishing trip and died of a massive heart attack. Essentially penniless, boarding with somebody else, still trying to earn every penny through his art. His beloved Mame had died a few years earlier. So he was alone, trying to improve his oil painting technique and trying to improve, by going through the river valleys of New York, his reputation as a painter. Really dedicated. Now, let me now go into saving Paul Sawyer because of his importance to us. And when I say us, I really mean everybody. I really mean anybody that could appreciate his art. It doesn't have to be a Kentuckian. You just don't have to be a Kentuckian. As a matter of fact, Paul Sawyer is connected to Ohio and New York and Kentucky in substantial ways. But when I say us, in particular, Kentuckians should rejoice over trying to save the memory, the details of Paul Sawyer and his work because of what he did for us. Number one, he gave us so many works with just pure intrinsic value of beauty. We don't have to use some sort of fancy description. We don't have to depend on some art critic to tell us, well, he was a minor impressionist. We don't have to do that. We simply have to look at them. So to us, he has become extremely important. Secondly, I notice there are a few people in the audience above the age of 30. Am I correct? Maybe above 35. And Paul Sawyer did something very special as an artist. He preserved those beautiful bygone days of his childhood and of his teen days and of his 20s and 30s in Kentucky. He preserved those through his art. And that makes him important to us. I mean, when I go to bed at night, I have the boys wading in the stream over my bed. And I've got 2 grandsons, and you may see them tonight. But when I look at that, I just think halcyon days, those wonderful days, the 1890s, and Paul Sawyer preserved that for us. There is a wild rumor that one of the boys in Boys Waiting is Howard Hughes. That is a wild rumor, but I thought, as a point of interest, I'd tell it to you. I have not in any manner confirmed that. But Howard Hughes was known to vacation in the Georgetown area as a child. And last, why is he important to us? Because you're going to have to help me here, but I have not discovered any artist of any reputation who has cataloged so much of the place that he painted in. And we're going to see that on the slide presentation, but all of his paintings along the Kentucky River are astounding. And all of his paintings here in Frankfort, he showed you exactly what it looked like back in the 1890s or the early 1900s. I'm going to show you in a minute the significance of the ones I have up there. 2 of them are from New York, and of course one is Mame, called Paul's Love. But for those reasons, we need to save him because he's important. He's important to us. He's done that for us, so we need to do something in return. And last but not least, and I like to always address the younger generation, in particular the children. You know, there are children out there, and they play with PlayStation 2 and Nintendo stuff and video games. And I've got my 2 grandsons, and I tell them all the time as they try to draw things, as they try to become artists. One is 6 and one is 10. Remember Paul Sawyer. Remember what he had to go through to paint, to learn to paint. And then look around you and see at all the creature comforts you have today. If Paul Sawyer could do it, you can do it. If Paul Sawyer could struggle through the Art Academy of Cincinnati and struggle through the Art League of New York, the Art Students League of New York, could get special training, could go into the wilderness, have no air conditioning, we need to save Paul Sawyer's memory for our children so they learn from him. Now, let me give you a brief biographical sketch. Paul Sawyer was born March 23, 1865 in Lafayette Township, Madison County, outside of London, Ohio, at a place known as Table Rock Farm. Table Rock Farm. The land holding there came from his grandfather on his father's side. His grandfather on his father's side was a lawyer who liked to not speculate in land, but he liked to actually represent people in land disputes and be paid in land as his fee. So he acquired a lot of acres in Ohio. I'm going to tell you that Table Rock Farm is located 6.2 or 3 miles outside of London, Ohio, a very cute little town. I had an opportunity to go there, and I'm going to tell you about that in a second. That is approximately 29 miles southwest of the capital of Ohio, Columbus. So that's where he starts. Now, he's born to Dr. Nathaniel Sawyer, essentially an Ohio group of people, the Sawyers, and Ellen Wingate Sawyer, essentially a true Kentuckian, born and raised in Frankfort, with ancestors that essentially helped found this whole pioneer area, born of Reuben Anderson and Penelope Hart Anderson. A very, very influential, very, very historical family. So that's where he came from. Now, you might wonder, how much do we know about his family lineage? If we were to trace Paul Sawyer's roots, where would they go? And I would tell you that they would go here. This takes the Sawyer-Wingate families back to about the year 700. They have a little bit of Scottish blood. They have a little bit of French blood. They have a lot of English blood. They have a little bit of Dutch blood. But I was able to use a book published about 1857 by a Sawyer, a family history. Combine that with some wonderful work by somebody out in San Francisco who I'd never heard of. I just happened to be plugging things into the search engines. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. His name is Ed Huson, H-U-S-O-N. And he started sending me all of these genealogical tracings of the Sawyer family because he was interested in it. And then I was able to confirm a good deal of what's on here through the family scrapbook kept by the Wingate side of the family. So I'm relatively confident that this is accurate. Not 100%, because you know in genealogy you kind of have to work along the family lines, and sometimes they just don't go where they're supposed to. But this is it. So I'm relatively confident we can know a lot about Paul Sawyer. When I struck out on this project 3.5 years ago, I wanted to do something special for Sawyer himself. I decided about 2 years ago that I wanted to give a talk like this at his birth site on his birthday. And then later that year, that's March 23rd, couldn't go back in time to 1865, but that's what I wanted to do. And then later that year, I wanted to give a talk like this at the site where he died, Fleischmann's, New York, near his date of death, November 5th, 1917. So I struck out on March 23rd. I was up at the public library in London, Ohio, and gave a talk. And an audience very much like this. And there were two people who kept looking at me kind of funny. And they were from Frankfort, Kentucky. And they couldn't believe that somebody was up in London, Ohio, talking about Paul Sawyer, because they loved him so much, but they didn't think anybody else had heard of him. So an article was written about my coming, and then another article in the newspaper was written about my talk. I think I have a copy over here on the table if you want to look at it. Now, something unusual happened, and before I go on with the biography, I want to throw out to you for your consideration a fictional account that was inspired by some of the words I spoke. Remember, Sawyer was only up there for 5 years. He was born in 1865, and in 1870, 5 years later, the family moved back here to Frankfort, to over there, to 112 East Broadway. So 5 years. Now, why is it significant, that 5 years? Well, running right about where Table Rock Farm was something called the Darby Creek. And, of course, we always think of Paul Sawyer and Elkhorn Creek. I'm going to show you when he goes to Fleischman's, New York, where he died. He's going to be painting that creek. If you see the winter scene there, that's Bushkill Creek that runs through the center of Fleischman's. So this is what I said to my audience as I spoke to them. I said, and this is a quote, "It is difficult for me as a student of Paul Sawyer's art not to make a direct connection between the beautiful land of Madison County. Sawyer loved to paint Kentucky's Elkhorn Creek, but from the time he was born until he was 5 years old, his mind knew the lovely Darby Creek." Just that one little statement in my talk. And a reporter picked up on that. And this is one of the 2 times I want to read something to you. And she converted that into, let's imagine what Paul Sawyer was like on Table Rock Farm. And here's what she said. Dennis Shepard, in researching for his book, feels these early childhood years spent along the Darby influenced Sawyer's painting. He loved to paint creek banks and small town landscapes. And my thoughts became haunted by the words I read. I could picture a 5-year-old farm boy reluctant to rise at daybreak. A thick mist lay over the pasture. His head barely rose above the grounded clouds, searching in the dark for cows who preferred to munch moist grass rather than be milked. He was frightened. His father's voice, "Boss, see, boss," echoed in the heavy air, giving some reassurance he was not alone. His shoes and pant cuffs were soggy from the wetted fields. What pleasure would be derived from a warm breakfast and a warm fire when the chores were done? On sweltering summer afternoons, maybe Paul ambled along a well-worn path to the Darby banks. Perhaps he skipped rocks with the other children, and the water rippled and swirled from below. Ancient trees looked down upon the lovely scene. Maybe Darby Creek lovers have hiked that same path. Did we cause the same water to ripple and swirl? Was it the same ripple, the same swirl? Did we throw the same stone? The same trees may have smiled down on us. Well, I think that's just a very nice way of somebody being inspired by Paul Sawyer to try to imagine what he was like as a child. And I really appreciate this little glimpse of Sawyer in Ohio. But let me continue with the thumbnail sketch of his life. As I said, the family couldn't make it as farmers up in Ohio. They just did not have the wherewithal to make enough money to stay at Table Rock Farm. And they had a safety clause, and that was 112 East Broadway here in Frankfort, the Wingate House. So in 1870, the family moved to the house owned by the Wingate side of the family. And you all are familiar with 2nd Street School, right? 2nd Street School is a very famous elementary school in Kentucky. And when Paul Sawyer entered 2nd Street School in 1871 as a 6-year-old, I guess a first grader, 2nd Street School was only about 3 years old. The floors were fresh pine. They were still rather new when Paul Sawyer entered. He went to school there for 10 years, and then he went to a local finishing school for children, the Dudley Institute. He was also tutored in art by a special tutor that his father hired for him, his father being a doctor, Nathaniel. I'm going to talk about him in a minute. But he was also tutored by his father, because guess what his father always wanted to be? An artist. He kind of kept that hidden. His father led a very unusual life, but his big desire was to travel to Paris and study under one of the great masters of his time. That was his father. So he always encouraged Paul in the area of art and tried to help him a little bit. In 1884, 1885, Paul Sawyer attended the art school or the art academy of Cincinnati, then under the principal instructor Thomas Satterwhite Noble. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Satterwhite Noble, but he was probably one of the most famous painters of his day. That is because he had a very unusual reputation. He was a Confederate officer who left the war, the Civil War, and all he could think of was how bad slavery was. So when he turned back to art, he did a couple of paintings. They were known as the anti-slavery paintings, and they became as famous as any paintings in America. And that led him to become the principal instructor for Paul Sawyer at the Art Academy of Cincinnati. 1886 and 87, two very significant things happened in Paul Sawyer's life. One, he became that twine salesman and learned that he did not want to earn a living that way. And two, he met somebody by the name of Mary Thomas Bull, Mame. You see her in the center picture. I call that particular painting Paul Sawyer's Mona Lisa. It has everything in it that Paul Sawyer thought was wonderful and worthy of love. Elkhorn Creek, boating, and Maine. In 1889, here he is now. He's had art tutoring from his father, special tutoring from someone else, and in 1884, special training at Art Academy of Cincinnati. Now he is admitted into the Art Students League of New York, probably one of the most famous art schools of his day, and does well there. Studies under the great American portrait artist William Merritt Chase. In 1908, something very significant happens to him. His mother dies. He's not free because his mother dies, and his mother extracts from him a mother's deathbed promise. And that promise is, I want you to promise me, Paul, that you will stay in Kentucky until your father passes away. Take care of him. In 1908, Paul kind of liquidated things around his house and struck out on the Kentucky River and spent 5 solid years in a houseboat going up and down the Kentucky River. Now, I'm going to take a short break if we can. I'm going to ask everybody to kind of look at what I have over here, and then we'll come back and finish with slides. 5 minutes, and if you just would kind of look. 1908 in a riverboat as your gallery, as your studio, and painting for 5 years on the Kentucky River. Sawyer did that, and he had a very small group of friends. One of them was a very famous person who came down from Cincinnati and was the chief engineer for renovating High Bridge. How many of you have been to High Bridge? Yeah. Well, that was known as the highest railroad trestle of its time. And Curtis Doherty became a very, very close friend of Paul Sawyer. And whenever bad weather would hit, Sawyer would take his houseboat and his 2 skiffs and pull up to the Curtis Doherty house and spend time with them. And if it wasn't Curtis Doherty, it was a ferry operator by the name of Bowman Terhune. Terhune's a very famous Kentucky name. And he would pull up and they would have a meal together. And there's one other aspect of his river life that I think you should know, and I think it's kind of misstated a lot of the time. He had a very, very close relationship with Rose, a person by the name of Rose Stoddard of Cincinnati. She later married and became Rose Stoddard Grimes. And Rose, in the Gilson book, I believe, is referred to as the companion to Curtis Dougherty's wife. I believe it was a maid of the household. I believe she was the maid for the Doughertys, not a companion. That's just my belief. Some people think that Rose took the place of Mame. And there are accounts of Mame, Mary Thomas Bull, coming to Highbridge for the last time, and then they had their argument or whatever, and they never got together after that. And then he took up with this Rose. I don't have anything in detail to go with those stories, though. In 1913, after his 5 years on the river, now we're into true independence. Now he is looking to free himself and become a great artist. And here's how he did it. First of all, his father died in 1910, and that meant that he had fulfilled his mother's promise. He had stayed in Kentucky while his father lived. His father was a doctor here in town. He tried to become a land baron in Ohio. It didn't work out. But it's my theory, and I think it's pretty obvious, that he was an Alzheimer's person, that he had Alzheimer's. And there are well-documented accounts of him taking off and getting lost, including one account where he was going to visit Paul. Paul was living in New York, and Nathaniel, Dr. Nathaniel Sawyier, took the train, and it stopped in Cincinnati, and he was missing for three days. I think it was 3 days. And they finally found him, and he was sitting in a Cincinnati hotel reading a newspaper. Didn't really know how he got there. So Paul at one time institutionalized him. And at another time, when Paul was absolutely broke, had sold 112 East Broadway, had to rely on his mother's side of the family, the Wingate side, and had to live as basically a charity case in the parsonage part of the First Baptist Church. He was allowed to live there with his father, and it's kind of a sad story that he had to resort to that. His grandmother had basically funded the rebuilding of First Baptist Church right outside the door here after it burned down. I think it burned down a couple of times, but I think this was rebuilding after 1868. Okay, so in 1913, his mother was dead, his father was dead, he had broken off with Mame, and he wanted a better reputation and better places to paint. So he heads to New York. He has a sister living in Brooklyn by the name of Lillian. She says, "Come board with me." And so he started painting, and all the paintings you may see in the gallery about Prospect Park, a lot of the New York's harbor scenes, he's painting while he lives with his sister Lillian until he's painted out. Now, one other reason that he became independent is he had an exclusive contract with a company, the Sears of its day, called C.F. Brower out of Lexington. And this exclusive contract said, we will buy everything you paint, and we'll give you this price for oils and that price for watercolors. Only one problem. The contract was expiring in 1914, about the time he wanted to be free of them. And Paul Sawyier painted faster than they could sell his art. So they were glad to let the contract end because he was painting too fast. All right, so now we arrive in Brooklyn. He's painting scenes in and about New York City, and he gets painted out there. He wants a new environment to paint in. And he meets in a paint supply store a woman by the name of Mrs. Meyer, and she says, well, you know, no one's painted up in my part of the woods, up in the Catskill Mountains. Why don't you come up there? Now, I'm going to give you a date real quickly, June 15th, 1915. 1915. That's when he arrives in a place called High Mount, New York. High Mount, New York. That's 1 mile exactly from the place he's going to die in Fleischmann's, New York. 1 mile up the mountain. and he paints from there. He takes up with a Belgium painter. They're allowed to live for free in a Dutch reformist chapel in the middle of the woods with one fireplace. And they go through the winter of 1915, 1916, and nearly freeze to death. And he begs his way into a boarding house down in Fleischmann's so he can survive. And that's where he went to Fleischmann's, and he met up with a wannabe artist by the name of Philip Schaefer. He wanted to be an artist in the worst way, and I think you see a catalog by him in the materials I set out. He actually did get around to painting enough that he had a catalog produced so that he could try to advertise his art, but it's not very good. Actually, that catalog is filled with Paul Sawyer paintings because he admired Sawyer so much, and he wanted to try to kind of live off of Paul Sawyer's name as well. So he's boarding there with Philip Schaefer. And then in November 5th of 1917, he goes out on a fishing trip, comes back in, and complains of chest pains. And a doctor is there almost immediately. Within minutes, a doctor is treating him, and he dies of a massive coronary right there. Now, I wanted to just give you, everybody tired yet? Can I give you a little bit more? I want to read to you just a little bit about from my book to give you an idea of how I'm trying to blend in the history of his time and try to stay away from art technique so much. Paul Sawyer lived between two great revolutions of the human soul. He was born on March 23, 1865, just 2 months before the Civil War concluded the bloody debate over the right of one human being to own another. He died on November 5, 1917, within 2 weeks of the Russian Revolution, an event that led to a 72-year social experiment practiced by the now defunct Soviet Union. Neither his birth nor his death occurred inside the borders of his beloved Kentucky. He was born in Lafayette Township, Madison County, Ohio, at a farm named Table Rock, acquired by grandfather Nathaniel as a fee for his attorney services. He died in the Catskill Mountains at the home of a wannabe artist, Philip Schaefer, in the tiny resort town of Fleischmann's, New York. Yet he is forever regarded as Kentucky's finest watercolorist. Sawyer was originally interred in the Fleischmann Cemetery. I'll show you that in a minute. But 6 years after he died, his cousin and lifelong companion, Russell McCrary, traveled to New York, dug up Sawyer, and brought his body back to Kentucky. Fittingly, he is buried at the highest point of the Frankfort Cemetery overlooking the Kentucky River, a river that provided the inspiration for so many of his paintings. His grandfather, on his mother's side, Henry Wingate, had been a founding elder of the cemetery. Paul used this cemetery as the principal location for 18 illustrations he painted for a doleful poem by Rose Terry Cook called Two Villages. The two villages described in the poem included the one enjoyed in life, the true hometown village, and that other one, the one we are all drawn to as a final home, the cemetery. Sawyer's grave overlooks the river he once called his home and studio, the Great Kentucky River. Sawyer lived on that river from 1908 until 1913 on a houseboat, painting the daunting river cliffs called the Palisades, as well as the magnificent man-made creation High Bridge, which Sawyer came to refer simply as the bridge. His unpretentious gravestone is located just 50 paces from the grave accompanying a majestic monument to Daniel Boone. Like Sawyer, Boone was born beyond Kentucky in Pennsylvania and died beyond Kentucky in Missouri. Like Sawyer, he was removed and traveled several hundred miles to be reinterred in Frankfort. No two men could be any more part of Kentucky than Boone, famous for his pioneering trips through the bluegrass, and Sawyer, whose pioneering art, pioneering Kentucky landscape, preserved the pristine beauty of the very woods, rivers, and creeks Boone had explored. In trying to assess the Sawyer legacy, it is hard to imagine another artist whose works chronicle so much of an entire region. His paintings reveal the quaint turn-of-the-century atmosphere of the state capital. He loved to paint Frankfort in the wintertime. In the painting, The Old Capitol, literally everything on the canvas is tinted with snow, including a horse and cart that is pulling. Probably his most famous winter landscape among native Kentuckians is Winter in Kentucky, a breathtaking view of the Kentucky River in Frankfort where Rowboats clinging to the shore by ropes are filled with snow. His art entailed many trips through all seasons over the hills and dales of Kentucky. He literally sweeps you down picturesque Elkhorn Creek time after time, painting after painting. His work, Paul's Love, centers on his longtime love interest, Mary Thomas Bull, the legendary Mame, sitting in a canoe perfectly framed by the trees, rocks, and waters of the Elkhorn. Within the body of the work by Sawyer, it is his personal Mona Lisa. Just skip a little bit, and I just want to add one thing. Sawyer lived at a monumental time. As his generation approached its turn-of-the-century celebration, he witnessed remarkable discoveries in the few short years of his life. Just 2 years after he was born, a young telegraph operator named Thomas Alva Edison worked in Louisville, Kentucky. Like Sawyer, Edison was born in Ohio. The Sawyer family moved from Table Rock Farm back to their first Kentucky homeland, Frankfort, Kentucky, in 1870, taking up residence at 112 Broadway, a large old brick house where Paul's maternal grandmother, Penelope Anderson Wingate, had been living. The 100 block of that street today has become a repository of all Kentucky history, because that is where the Kentucky History Center and the Kentucky Historical Society are co-located. But the Sawyers and Wingates were there first, with roots reaching back to the country's first settlers. In 1879, when Edison was demonstrating the incandescent light, 14-year-old Paul was moving towards the light of art, displaying even at this early age a remarkable talent. Inside the bookends of the Civil War and the Great War, World War I, he lived and loved and honed his talents as a master of watercolors and oils of both portrait painting and landscape painting. He was just 11 when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876. This was also the year when baseball's National League was founded. The next year, Edison invented the phonograph. In 1885, 20-year-old Sawyer completed a year of art studies at the Cincinnati Art Academy. And in that same year, George Eastman began manufacturing coated photographic paper. Sawyer's art was to some extent shaped by his own use of photographs. That's how I'm trying to blend in the story of Sawyer with the story of all other things that were happening in our country. Now, for the rest of the presentation, that concludes the thumbnail sketch of Sawyer. I'd like just to show you some slides, and I'd like to try to apply those two ideas that I mentioned at the beginning. The concept known as conversion, where we see something rather plain, but after he gets through painting it, it's something magnificent. And something else called the significance of a particular place, a significant meaning, how he chose sites. So let's try that. Gene, do I have to hit something? It's on the time saver or something. The first slide is going to be the reason why I had to put Paul Sawyer on hold. This young man is from Baghdad, Kentucky. Anybody from Baghdad, Kentucky? Anybody know where Baghdad, Kentucky is? I was researching and drafting Paul Sawyer, and this young man's story came to me. He was the first injured Kentuckian in last year's invasion of Iraq. His name is Sean Cassidy. So I wrote a book that's coming out in about 2 weeks. It's called Returning Son. The full title is Returning Son. The full title is Returning Son from Baghdad, Kentucky to Baghdad, Iraq, and back. He is back in Iraq after having his legs crushed. That's Paul Sawyer when he's 7 years old. And the only reason I put that one up is so I could show you this one. Those are my two grandsons, age 6 and age 10. And they are true students of Paul Sawyer. I always try to pass on to them what I know about Paul Sawyer. And I've given them tests. They have to give tours of my house. I have Paul Sawyer prints all over my house. And they have to take people around and explain what those prints mean. This is Table Rock Farm. This is why we have to save the memory of Paul Sawyer. I located with the land deed people up in Ohio where Table Rock Farm is supposed to be. Can you all see that now better? And as I said, it's 6.2 miles outside of London, Ohio. There is no farm there now. It's a cornfield and a grove of trees. That's all we have. But there is this. There is a road. There is a state highway there. And there is that, the Longaberger Gift Award. And the Longaberger Gift Award is a free gift of putting a highway historical marker when you can justify it. And 2 years ago, I'm a retired lieutenant colonel from the Air Force. I used to do award packages all the time. I was very good at writing award packages. I sent all sorts of copies of the works of Paul Sawyer to justify it, and they rejected my application. So I'm going to try again. But I think we need to have a marker there saying this is where Paul Sawyer was born. When he died in 1917, he didn't come back to Kentucky. He was buried here. It's kind of like a pauper cemetery. It's called Covesville Cemetery, but when you look at the church that is right next to it, that church is called Clovesville Church, Clovesville Baptist. Something got messed up between the name of the cemetery and the name of the church, but he resided there. And now he resides here, up in our cemetery, here in Frankfort. As I said, 50 paces away from Daniel Boone's grave. Russell McCrary, his lifelong companion and his cousin, took the trip up 5.5 years after he was buried in Covesville and brought him back here where he belongs. There's Boone's Bluff. That's what got me started on my search for Paul Sawyer. This, as I said, if you stand below that log house behind the arsenal, you will see pretty much what he painted. And here's the conversion. There's his painting, and it's not a very good image because I had to scan it in. And there's what it looks like, and it doesn't look all that great when it's a photograph. Some people say, well, photography is going to make painting unnecessary. No, I don't think so. This is the conversion I'm talking about. He's taken that, pretty much what we see today, and he's converted into something magnificent. There's that thing I talk about in the book. I think it's one of the most popular paintings that Paul Sawyer did among Kentuckians. This scene here. And here's conversion again. Now, if you go down below 2nd Street School and you look across, you're pretty much looking from the perspective of winter in Kentucky. And look at what a magnificent job he did of turning it into art. This is one of my favorites, the blacksmith shop. This also hangs in my bedroom. And that's supposedly Willie Underback's blacksmith shop in Sawyer's day. And you know where that's located? Louisville Hill. So if you go up that road and look to the left, are we going to see the Capitol? Not then? But now? Okay. And you see this right here, the little building there? Well, I'm going to show you the photograph of where this was painted from. If you look about 50 yards up from the photograph I'm going to show you, you'll see a concrete foundation still exists there where that building may have been. Okay. There it is today. That's what it looks like. What a great conversion. Now, the blacksmith shop, through my research, is not this building. It's the one over. This is I think it's a car repair shop or something. And then right next to it is a VCR shop. Any of you recall that? 2nd Street School is back here. And I'm relatively certain it's the VCR shop that was the site of the old blacksmith shop. And here's why I think it's correct. You would think it's right in here, right? Okay. Well, when I went into the VCR shop and I talked to the owners, they said that they thought a blacksmith shop used to be where they were. And I said, well, how do you know that? Well, when we moved in, we got this thing, and they showed me a very old anvil. So I understand that, but I think this is the trees are kind of misleading. But whether it's here or whether it's one building over, this is the Louisville Hill, and this is the conversion I'm talking about, how you can take something relatively plain. This is also an example of what I was talking about as far as the significance of meaning for a site. In his day, this was a very important part of Frankfort. The blacksmith shop was there. 2nd Street School was there. He seemed to always have a knack, whatever town he painted, of going to the heart of the town and painting the most significant area. What's that? Elks Club of Frankfort, right? Probably on its last legs in this photograph. And then he converted it into this. Now, a lot has been said about his treatment of horses. He seems to use the same horse over and over again. You look at his paintings of horses, and you'll probably find this fellow as the horse in most of them. Okay? He just didn't want to waste time doing horses, so he used the same one over and over again.
Where's that Elks Club? Is that Lewis Street? Where's that Lewis Street?
I think Lewis Street is what I remember, but you probably know better than I do. Yes, yes. What's that? The old Capitol Hotel. And he did so many, he probably did a dozen very famous views of the old Capitol Hotel. Sometimes in winter, sometimes rainy days, sometimes just plain old Capitol Hotel. And one of the reasons that we have to save Paul Sawyer is this. This is the old Capitol Hotel burning to the ground.
Where was that located? The old Capitol Hotel?
Yes. This is the actual photograph taken from, I believe, the roof of the State National Bank, looking down. It's a roof scene looking at the smoldering, burning old Capitol Hotel. Across Ann Street. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, this is Paul Sawyer's library right here, over here. In his day, it was the Federal Building. Okay, so again, he's picking out something significant, and this fountain, this is a fountain back in his day, doesn't exist anymore, of course. What's that back there?
The Lincoln Chapel is right over there.
Yes, and parsonage would be back in the alleyway behind there, but this is First Baptist Church, and you'll see that church creeping out of the mist in a lot of his paintings. It had very special meaning to him. Of course, his grandmother.
The lower part of the church, they call it Lincoln Chapel.
There is today. Held up well. Now, in the Gilson book, in this book, Gilson, when he wrote his little biography of Sawyer, an artist sketched, according to Gilson's sketch, this chapel I told you about up in Highmount where Sawyer almost froze to death. Okay? And you all know Bill Coffey of the Paul Sawyer Gallery. Actually, he's not really associated in the retail part of that now. But Bill Coffey is probably a world-class expert on Paul Sawyer because he's reproduced so many of his paintings. And Bill gave me his old directions on how to get to things in Fleischmann's, New York, and in Highmount, New York, when I went up to speak. And I got lost using his directions, so I just started driving around the mountains of Highmount area, and I ran into this. And that's it. That is the chapel that you just saw. That is where he nearly froze to death, and you can see it's almost reclaimed by the forest. Now, I'm kind of a sentimental person, and some things that mean a lot to me might not mean anything to you. But since I'm a lawyer, I yelled for the groundskeeper 3 times very loud, and he didn't come. So I felt that I was not trespassing if I went inside there. I went inside there, and there was just strewn on the floor just pieces of old dishes, pieces of newspaper, and really I was looking for a brush or a pallet, you know, something to prove that Sawyer was there. Now remember I told you earlier to remember the date, June 15th, 1915, that's when Sawyer arrived in Highmount. That's when he started living in here with that Belgian painter, Edward Bike. And the only thing that I could find, a couple of scraps from the New York Tribune dated September 22nd, 1915 and August of 1915. Now, to me, that means a lot because I found a couple of newspapers during the exact time that Sawyer was supposed to be living in there. And for the sake of preservation, I confiscated those bits of newspaper, and I have them for research purposes only. What's that?
Who owns it now?
This whole area is probably a 30-acre estate. In Sawyer's day, it was owned by a family by the name of Emery. And I don't know who the current owners are, but they've just kind of let it go. And while I was up there, I'll tell you in a second, I was trying to save Paul Sawyer, and I was trying to convince them to renovate some things. This was one of them that I mentioned when I was up there. They need to go out and save this because it has significance. I just think it's a beautiful building, too. It's a Dutch Reformist church, and then they use it as a studio.
What
Now-
made you feel that was the actual site, the place where he was?
Oh, I know that's it. I know that's it because I had a map, and the map was based on what Gilson said in his notes. Now, Gilson, you know, he wrote these little biographies, and they're not very long, and they're kind of passionate about Sawyer. He kind of goes overboard in his trying to show you that Sawyer was great, and I don't mind that. But when you go to the University of Louisville, where the Gilson papers are, then you find out that he has done meticulous work tracking all this stuff down. He probably did a half a dozen trips to Fleischmann's and Highmount himself when he was researching Paul Sawyer's life. So I'm confident that that chapel that you saw is the right one. And the main reason I would say is if you look at the sketch, you see this? That's in the chapel that doesn't show up in the picture. You see this very unique porch? That's in the chapel. As a matter of fact, it was breaking off. When I was non-trespassing, I had to jump over it a little bit. So I'm very confident that's the one. And I find that rather exciting.
Well, the windows are the same.
Yeah, clearly. And when you have the windows and the porch and the skylight and the fireplace where it's supposed to be, it's pretty good guess. You got the right one. This is Cityside, but this is called the firehouse here. This is another example where Sawyer picks this meaningful place in a town. This is Fleischmann's, where he died. And he did probably, 3 key paintings. You see the one over there, the far one? That's it. All right? Now, this is an example of picking a very significant place in the town. You can't see it in this reproduction, but there is a Model T passing a horse and buggy. Some people think that has some sort of significance. I don't really think it has that much. But it's a very beautiful thing. There it is today. There it is today. Now, after giving my talk, and included among the members of my little audience at the library in Fleischmann's near the day that he died in November, I said, you need to do something about this. This has significance. Paul Sawyer has basically preserved this for all ages. He did 3 almost identical perspectives, 3 different paintings, using this as kind of the centerpiece. And I had good luck and bad luck. The good luck was they said, yes, we'll do that. We'll allocate some money. But unfortunately, their budget was 0, so it didn't mean a whole lot. So far, I have not gotten any good feedback that we've saved Paul Sawyer in Fleischmann's. Okay? That's pretty close to what you see in his painting. Can you recognize this based on anything that I put out front, maybe? This frozen over is Winter Screen. That's it. As a matter of fact, when I was up there, I had a copy of Winter Stream with me, and I was looking at the way the buildings were set, and they match pretty well. So this is the stream that goes through the middle of Fleischmann's, called Bushkill. And so you got Elkhorn Creek, Bushkill, and Darby, and Little Darby. Okay. And that's it. Look how he converted that. This is not holding, as you can tell, this is not holding up very well. The town has kind of let this whole area go downhill. So Paul Sawyer saved it for us. This is Philip Schaefer's house. And this is where Paul Sawyer died. As a matter of fact, he died in this room up here. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you with, and I hope I've covered enough about Paul Sawyer and enough about the work I'm doing with him to convince you he's worth saving. I want to tell you about another amazing coincidence. Remember I told you that when I went to talk in Ohio, this Kentucky couple happened to be in my audience. This is even more amazing. I struck out with my wife to go up to Fleischmann's to take pictures and to locate Paul Sawyer scenes on my own agenda, on my own time, and had gone to their library, and kind of like this presentation, I set up some prints and got everything set up, and there were some flyers going around town. Shepard's coming to talk about Paul Sawyer. And the day that I was to talk, that November day a couple years ago, somebody who had struck out from Frankfort on a different agenda, who was a native, Frankfort native, who has a lot of historical roots here, happened to pass through Fleischmann's that very day. Went into that library to ask directions on how to get to some of the sites that Paul Sawyer painted. Saw the stuff I had set up and said, "What's going on here?" And that man is right over there, Jeff Jeffers. And I just thought it was the most amazing coincidence in the world. And actually, as we get closer to finishing the draft of my book, I think we're going to strike a little arrangement because he has a treasure trove of great photographs. But I just thought that was amazing. And there was one other amazing thing that happened during that trip. If you look in the Professor Jones book, you're going to see that he was asked to paint the father of one of the people who owned the Emery estate. The father's name was Todd. And so he took a photograph, and Professor Jones shows you the photograph of this person who had passed away. And then he did a portrait of it. It was a very beautiful, beautiful portrait of this tall Mr. Todd standing against a snowy background. I'm speaking to my audience, and I look, and there's somebody in the back who looks very familiar. And I just kind of check my memory and say, this cannot be. And it almost looked like the reincarnation of Mr. Todd, and it turned out to be Mr. Todd's grandson. It was just amazing. So I hope by giving this presentation you're motivated a little bit to save Paul Sawyer, to spread the word. I hope you've enjoyed the little thumbnail sketch and the little side-by-side of photographs and paintings. But most of all, I just hope, like me, you really love Paul Sawyer art, because that's what it's all about. Thanks.
What are your thoughts about this program? Cable 10 would like to hear your comments and suggestions regarding this and other Cable 10 programming. Please call our viewer comment line at 352-9100. You will have 1 minute to leave your message. You can also send email messages to cable10@fewpb.com.